I'm sure we've all heard and seen the phrase online that Fernando Alonso is toxic. In fact, I'm 100% certain that there are people watching this video right now that have said that online at some point themselves. I mean, it only takes a couple of seconds to search the words Fernando Alonso toxic on Twitter to see a ton of related tweets. But why do some people consider Fernando to be toxic and in some cases detrimental to the team despite his talents and achievements in Formula 1? Is his toxicity real, or is it just a bandwagon effect in the sense that if one person says that he's toxic, then, well, why don't I? And also, what makes a driver like Fernando constantly find himself in controversial situations? When we talk about the career of Fernando Alonso, there is no getting away from the fact that he himself has either directly or indirectly been involved in more than his fair share of controversies. In fact, I'm not quite sure who out of Alonso, Schumacher, Prost and Senna has had more on and off-track controversies and intra-team political battles. With Fernando, however, it all starts with 2007, McLaren, a young Lewis Hamilton, and Hungary. Now, what's important to remember is that although people often go straight to Hungary when talking about the breakdown between Alonso and McLaren, in reality the problems within the team were building up long before then. In Monaco, for example, when Alonso took the victory and led a McLaren 1-2, Ron Dennis actually implemented team orders to try to secure the best result for the team, but Lewis Hamilton wasn't happy and began to unnecessarily push towards the end of the race and pressure Fernando. Now, although the team did get the perfect result, Ron Dennis, according to test driver Pedro de la Rosa after the race inside the team, said that it should have been Lewis who should have won the race instead of Fernando, which undermined Fernando's win within the team and already began to cause a rift. This was just one example, but then we get to Hungary. Now, we all know what happened just before their final runs in Q3. Both of the McLarens pulled into the pits, but when it was time to go with the clock running down, Fernando held Lewis up in the pits for a significant amount of time, which cost him the chance to have a final run in qualifying and handed the pole to Alonso. Everyone knows that incident, but what's quite interesting is what happens if you ask people the question of why? Why did Fernando do this? Did he just wake up and decide to ruin Lewis's lap that weekend and cause chaos within the team? No. If we rewind back in that qualifying session, Fernando was actually supposed to be the driver right at the beginning who should have been let out first in front of Lewis to set his lap time first. This alteration between drivers is common and even done now by Mercedes between Lewis and Valtteri in altering races. Lewis, however, went against the team and went out first, ignoring team orders from the team and Ron Dennis to let Alonso back past. Lewis ended up ruining Fernando's first run, and so hence why Fernando blocked him in the pits from doing his second run. To get an in-depth explanation of this, and in particular the part that Lewis played which people never really talk about, then definitely go and check out Mark Priestley's video that will be linked below. He is by far the best person to tell the story because he was there as a McLaren engineer in the garage when it was happening.
Lewis, controversially aided by his race engineers and mechanics, broke from the agreed plan and left the garage first to queue up at the end of the pit lane ahead of the final session of qualifying. Clearly there was some collaboration between Lewis and his engineers to be able to send the car out early, but this was definitely not the plan. Some people assumed it was just a mistake and that Lewis would move over, allowing Fernando past as they got going, and Lewis sped off into the distance. He'd gone rogue.
This incident showed that Fernando at times simply couldn't control his emotions, and ultimately this wouldn't be the final time either. However, the Hamilton side to the Hungary incident very rarely gets mentioned by anyone. Part of this, in my opinion, is down to the bias in the British media at the time, and part of it is also down to the favoritism and support that Lewis received at McLaren. What Fernando didn't realise, and what no one could have known at the time, is that even though he was the defending double world champion, he was stepping into Lewis's team. Although Lewis was just a rookie, he was signed by McLaren and Dennis at the age of 13. He was a British driver in a British team that was headed by Ron Dennis himself, and he had also done multiple days of testing with McLaren cars in 2006 in both Silverstone and Jerez. In the end, Fernando feeling like the outsider at McLaren, and then the subsequent fallout with Ron Dennis was the final straw. The truth is that all three of them were at fault in some way, but it was Fernando's reputation which took the biggest hit as the McLaren team had become radioactive. Now, before I go any further, I do just want to quickly say that according to my YouTube analytics, over 80% of the people watching my videos are currently not subscribed to my channel. Now, if you do enjoy my content, then please do consider subscribing. I put a lot of time and effort into these videos, and it also gets us closer to that big landmark of 100,000 subscribers. Anyway, let's get back into it. The 2008 Crashgate scandal and the 2010 Hockenheim team orders incident are two unrelated controversies that have a weird place in Fernando's career, given that he actually was only involved in them indirectly. The reason why I've decided to briefly talk about these two together is that technically in both scenarios Fernando himself was cleared of any wrongdoing or involvement by the FIA. However, even if Fernando technically didn't organize or know beforehand about any of these incidents, there is still something to be said about the fact that Fernando just always seems to find his way in the middle of these kinds of incidents, and then coincidentally benefited from both of them by winning the races. It's hard to really analyze retrospectively what this says about Fernando as a person, but what it does do is further the toxicity narrative, and it also drives the question forward that where there is smoke, there is usually fire. Fernando at Ferrari was actually a great match because not only was he at his absolute peak, but he never really had an issue with coping with that famous Ferrari pressure. If anything, he thrived in it. What did start to break the bond was when Fernando consistently didn't receive cars that could compete with Red Bull and McLaren. He began to publicly criticize the team and then internally started to lose faith in Ferrari. By the time it came to 2014, although he was still contracted until 2016, he began to lose trust in Ferrari, and his departure from the team wasn't exactly clean as Ferrari tried to play it out as though they had dropped him in favour of Vettel, when in reality it was Alonso who decided to null the contract early. But once again, did he make things worse internally by publicly criticising the team? Absolutely, and this brings us right back to the fact that Fernando too often wears his heart on his sleeve and struggles to keep his emotions in check, especially in moments where keeping the Ferrari mess out of the media was more important. Having said that though, as a driver, there is very little that he could have done more for Ferrari with what he was given. In 2010, he overcame a 47-point deficit to lead the title going into the final race, before the famous Ferrari master plan put him on the famous bad strategy behind Petrov and lost him the World Championship. In 2012, he drove what was in my opinion his greatest ever season, taking only the 4th or 3rd best car on the grid to a title decider, and by the time we get to 2014, where Ferrari produced their worst car yet, Fernando still scored almost 75% of the team's total points against world champion teammate Kimi Räikkönen. I mean, what more did they want him to do with the cars that he was given? Even after 5 years at the team, Ferrari not once gave him the best car on the grid, and so personally, I've never really blamed him for getting frustrated in 2014 and doubting as to whether or not he should keep committing to Ferrari. Looking back, we are all geniuses with the benefit of hindsight, knowing what actually happened, but the main reason why Alonso decided to go back to McLaren is that Mercedes proved that being able to control your own power unit was going to be key to being able to win championships in the V6 turbo hybrid era. On paper, McLaren looked to be set for years to come. They now had their own power unit with Honda, they had easily one of the strongest driver lineups on the grid with Alonso and Button, and in terms of the Alonso-Dennis relationship, they both admitted that they had buried the hatchet a long time ago and were ready to win. Not a single person could have predicted how bad the McLaren Honda car would be, and with Fernando he couldn't just put a fake smile on, and so of course he made his feelings very aware with some of his infamous radio messages which capped off the belief that Fernando Alonso was toxic within the team. Now, we often talk about drivers not always having good cars and sometimes be given cars that underperform, but believe me when I say this, there are levels to bad cars. So whilst Lewis Hamilton in 2009 was only given a car that was capable of 2 wins, whilst Seb in 2020 was given a car that was only capable of 3 podiums, Fernando in 2015 with McLaren in their new era was given a car that only had 6 point finishes with 13 DNFs, and on top of that the team finished down in 9th in the Constructors, only ahead of Marussia. It was a joke. So that's why when we talk about the radio outbursts, when we talk about the criticisms of the team, it's one thing to be given a bad car for 1 season, it's another to be given a bad car season after season after season after season. If I was in a team that for 4 years straight underdelivered despite having one of the biggest budgets in F1, I would have lost my mind way earlier than Fernando did. And many people since have said that it was Fernando that was the reason for the poor cars, but that to me doesn't make any sense. Firstly, McLaren were bad in their very first season which he came in back in 2015. Now, if people blame Fernando for the bad cars, then where does Button fit into all of this? Surely if that logic is true, then Button, who went from challenging for the world title to struggling to score points, is equally at fault for being at the team for the longest and being there throughout their entire downfall. So that is why, despite Fernando's outbursts in some of the worst cars McLaren has ever produced, this notion that he somehow is the reason McLaren kept on under-delivering just doesn't make any sense. Especially then when you take into account that Fernando in his 4 years scored 68% of the team's total points against Button and Van Dorn. In the end, Fernando's career when he first retired in 2018 did not end in the way that it should have. It's what needed to happen, however, for both Alonso and McLaren, and with Zak Brown and Andreas Seidel heading the team now, they've since been back on track and focusing more on themselves instead of making ridiculous expectations and claims every single year like they did under Ron Dennis and Eric Boullier during their McLaren Honda era. I've personally always found it quite hard to talk about Alonso in terms of his toxicity, or at least what's perceived as toxic by other people. I've said it before on my channel that the 3 drivers who I will always have a huge connection and bias towards are Lewis, Seb and Fernando. These are the drivers from my generation, and these are the drivers who made me fall in love with Formula 1. His flaws and vulnerabilities as a person are all intertwined in his incredible driving ability, and every single driver in Formula 1 has their positives and their negatives, and just as there are no perfect people in the world, there is equally no such thing as a perfect driver. With Fernando, you get the rough with the smooth, and although throughout his career too much blame has been put on his shoulders for the failures of others, it's also true that whilst some situations he's been in have been down to bad luck, he equally sometimes hasn't made them any better with some of the things that he has said and done himself. All of his traits and characteristics are what makes him one of the greatest pure racing talents of all time, but equally a flawed genius who could have achieved more. So there you are. Now, I hope you did enjoy this video. Of course, let me know all of your thoughts in the comments box below, and if you did enjoy this video, then don't forget to drop it a like and smash that subscribe button. We are on the road to 100k, so hopefully we get there soon, and guys, I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.